got your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to CN Live, Season 6, Episode 13, Part 2 of Inside the Films of John Pilger. I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. The British Film Institute is paying a tribute to the late filmmaker John Pilger with a series of screenings of some of his 60 films that will be aired through the end of November. On Monday evening at 6:15 p.m. at the British Film Institute South Bank, a panel discussion will take place led by Anthony Hayward. He's the author of In the Name of Justice, the television reporting of John Pilger. The panel will include film director Ken Loach, Christopher Hurd of Dartmouth Films, and Richard Creasy, former head of documentaries at ATV and Central Independent Television. CN will publish a video of the discussion. At the end of the panel, Consortium News will present the Gary Webb Freedom of the Press Award to John Pilger's partner, Jane Hill. We were able to inform John a couple of months before he died in December 2023 that he had won the award. This will be followed on Monday night by a screening of his film, The War You Don't See, in 2010. Some of the other films to be shown during the month of November are The Quiet Mutiny, 1970, which broke the story of U.S. soldiers' drug-taking and rebellion against their officers. Year Zero, The Silent Death of Cambodia, about the aftermath of Pol Pot's regime and the genocide. Palestine is Still the Issue, 2002. Death of a Nation, 1994, about repression in East Timor. Breaking the Silence, The Truth and Lies in the War on Terror, in 2003. The Coming War on China, 2016. And Utopia, 2013. About discrimination against Indigenous Australians in Pilger's homeland. Joining us on CN Live today to discuss John Pilger, the filmmaker, are two men who work closely with him. David Boardman is a journalist and assistant producer for John Pilger on several of his films, and Tom Giles, head of current affairs at ITV. We're joined now by David Boardman. He's a journalist and he was an assistant producer for John Pilger and many of his films, and by Tom Giles, who is currently the head of current affairs at ITV and a documentary commissioner. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on CN Live to talk about John Pilger and his films. David, let me start with you. When did you meet John Pilger, and tell me what you actually did for him?
First started working with John in 1994. I'd been working with Paul Foote, who's another rather remarkable investigative journalist. And we first did a film called Flying the Flag, Arming the World, which was about arms dealing. I'd done a couple of films with a guy called Anthony Sampson on that subject. So that's how we got together and made the first film, and then we went 6 on the run after that.
What did you do exactly for him? What were your duties?
My duty was, the background research was to find who we were going to interview. I already knew something about the arms dealing game, and I knew some dealers, but the majority of all arms deals are done by governments, and governments change. So we had an array of interviewees, starting with the venerable Dennis Healy, who had been a Minister of Defence in a Labour government in the 60s, who actually set up the Defence Export Sales Organisation, which is the British government selling arms to other countries to finance its own productions. We went to the Paris Air Show, we went to the Farnborough Air Show, we went all over the place, and there were some quite difficult interviews, as there always were with John, because you had to confront the powers that be with what they were doing and why it was wrong.
And what was his style of interviewing like that you observed?
John was very direct. He never asked a soft question to begin with, but he wasn't prepared to play anybody's games. he had a list of things he was going to talk about, and that's what he did.
I was at the funeral for John back in February, and you told some funny stories. So, can you repeat them here?
The stories I remember, the film before Flying the Flag, Arming the World was called Death of a Nation. It was about East Timor. We updated it years later, but in that film, which I think was the first one that ran over an hour, the main opposition Timorese leader was a guy called José Ramos Horta, who's now the president. But he was in hiding a lot of the time when that production was going on. When we updated it, we interviewed him in John's house. And we got him ready, got lights set up.
Sorry, his house where? In Sydney?
No, in London, in Clinton. And we soon noticed that while he was getting ready for the interview, José had been sitting in a chair which was normally inhabited by John's cat, Daisy. And the poor guy in his black slack trousers was covered in cat's hair. So with a roll of tape, I removed all the hair from the guy's trousers while he was still wearing them, so that he could look presentable on television. And the great quote he said afterwards, after he'd been interviewed by John, he said, being interviewed by Pilger is a piece of cake in comparison with the ordeal I've just gone under sellotape, which brought the house down in a way. But there's one thing that stamped a mark on me early on. During that Timor film, they interviewed the then Minister of Defense, not the Secretary of State, the Minister of Defense, who's the notorious Alan Clark, and who really didn't care about who he sold arms to. He referred to the Third World as bongo land and such words as that. But John came to him straight and said, but, I read that you're a vegetarian. You care greatly about cruelty to animals. And it's rather remarkable that you have the opposite opinions when you think and talk about human beings. And Clark just paused briefly, looked plain-faced at John and said, curious, isn't it? And it was what we then referred to as the Alan Clark moment. We're always looking for a guy or a woman who was going to appear in the film and fulfill that role, which was just the barefaced lack of caring about people.
Right. Sociopath. So, Tom, let me move to you. Tell us what you're talking to John Pilger. When did you first meet him, and what?
Well, I'm a very late arrival into the John Pilger world. Having really only started working with him on the coming war on China, which was the film he put out on ITV. It was his 60th film for ITV in 2016, which was the feature-length film he did about the US. Basically how the US had been squaring up to China and the Pacific region and its hegemony over that region for decades. And what I can say about that in terms of my actual involvement, because a lot of what John did in as well as being obviously, and I think this is why it was important that he did all these films on ITV. And obviously I inherited that history. And there was never any sense that we would do anything other than carry on with it. And I think that's partly because, we always, I'd like to say I have, and my predecessors as well as others, have understood that there is a need and a place, as he always passionately advocated, for films with an independent voice, for people to be allowed on mainstream, particularly the public service broadcasters in our country, to have the sort of voice that he has, because people respect him and they respect that voice. And I think it's a really important part of what you might call our sort of journalistic ecosystem, that John kept doing what he did. And this was no different. The other thing I really respected about John, which you hinted at earlier, was that he always took the argument to the people he was making the argument against. So he always had the point of having a proper interview, getting interviews. He was very, very good at getting these interviews. They were usually at sort of assistant secretary of state level or deputy spokesman for the prime minister kind of level. But, you know, and when they sat down, you could, you know, he managed to get their sort of perspective, if you like, while at the same time framing it very cleverly within the wider perspective that he was telling. And he was forceful, and his questions were, you know, extremely to the point and good. I mean, in as much as they couldn't argue that they didn't know what his position was when he was interviewing them. But what it did was it created a really clear perspective, while at the same time hearing their position, if you like, albeit within the framework of the films he did. In terms of that film in particular, which was, I think, 110 minutes. So this was way over the era of him doing films as an hour. I remember sending a few notes off to Christo, having gone through it all. I mean, it was quite a long film. It went through a lot of history. It went through the Marshall Islands, the atomic experimentation in the Bikini Atoll. You know, it told the history of China. It talked about the bases in Okinawa in Japan. I mean, it was a pretty, in John's usual fashion, it was a sweep of history in the same time, including what was happening at that moment in terms of the South China Sea. So there was a lot to say about that. And I dutifully sent quite a list of things that I'd seen and just questions and queries. Anyway, Christo said, well, let's all go and have a proper viewing at the Soho screening rooms or wherever they were. So we all go down. I think it was me and Kevin Ligo, who's been around a long time as the director of programs. And anyway, we sat down and I was sort of scribbling away. And, you know, the film was, you know, really, really strong in some parts, perhaps less so in others. But, you know, it was 110. And at the end, there were like loads of things I wanted to say. And just at that moment, Kevin, who's obviously been around this before, got up and said, John, thank you so much. That was an absolutely excellent film. And at that point, it was pretty clear that there wasn't really going to be that many more notes or that many more feedback. And the second time was on the NHS film we did, The Dirty War on the NHS, which was another, I thought, really powerful film. I think it was the last one he did, for us at least, 2019, just before, well, just around the time of the election. And again, I think there was it's 120 minutes or whatever it was. Maybe you could trim it a little bit. And John went, yes, absolutely. I'll trim it. And I think it actually came back to us, I think it's fair to say, a little bit longer than we saw it. But in the end, you know, he commanded that sort of respect, and we were happy. We were always happy to have his output and happy to have his films. I mean, and he was always a very warm guy. I mean, I had obviously heard him by reputation. I had one brush with him way before that, when I was at the BBC, when I was a producer in Iraq during the Iraq War. And it was completely coincidental. It wasn't really about a program we were doing, where I had been with a team. I was basically doing a panorama film about the war. And we'd been, very unfortunately, the victims of the sort of thing that, you know, John would have raged about and did rage about. We had a friendly fire from the American side. They dropped a bomb on us, and I think they killed 21 people, including our translator. And, you know, which was incredibly shocking and just extraordinary. It was extraordinarily incompetent. It was just a disaster, and the sort of thing that probably happens all the time, but it's very rare to have a crew actually there filming it all. And anyway, the piece went out on the news. This was because John Simpson was there, and he put it out on the news. Although I was doing a longer film, I was there kind of on their coattails. And I had told him the story of what actually happened the moment the bomb came in, which is that I'd been actually on the phone to my mum, because it was my birthday, on those Thuraya sat phones, which I'd worked out you could put a SIM card in to your own number. And she happened to ring up just as I was parking the car up and getting the equipment out for the cameraman, Fred Scott. And just at that moment, I'd made a joke to her because these planes were two F-16s. No, they weren't F-16s. I'm sorry. They were F-14s from an American aircraft carrier. Were like really, really low. And I made a joke to her because she was very opposed to the war. And I had had a previous skirmish with an American Air Force general who used to basically, we did an interview with a guy. When the jets fired up, he'd sort of say, that gentleman is the sound of freedom. So I basically said, look, Mum, listen, you can just hear. And I put the phone up and said, there's the sound of freedom as a joke. And unfortunately for me, I'd relayed that to my colleagues afterwards when we were slightly dazed. And I think John Simpson wrote it up in the Telegraph without pointing out that that was a joke. So John Pilger did this massive piece called The Sound of Freedom. And the first words were the BBC man who who announced the sound of freedom to the sound of American jets, got it spectacularly wrong. But that sort of underpins the BBC's perspective on the entire war, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, I was slightly raw about that and a little bit upset. And I wrote to the editor of New Statesman, who I don't think I got a reply, but in the end, I got hold of John. And, he took the trouble. He really sort of got it. He got because what had happened to someone on the ground. And he understood, what we'd witnessed and what I'd seen. And, he wrote me a really nice long letter basically saying, he was really sorry about the misunderstanding. But he was still right about the BBC sort of thing. So that was my first direct meeting with John.
Well, John Simpson got it wrong, basically.
Well, John Simpson got my joke wrong. Yeah, he didn't tell me he was filing the article, and he didn't put the humor in it that I clearly had meant by it. I clearly wouldn't have said something like that seriously.
And did he know that, Simpson? Just to put a point on that.
Oh, I don't know. I remember this was published in a British newspaper. I was in Bill at the time, so I don't know the full background to whether or not, I think it was for the Telegraph, or whether the Telegraph took out the joke because they thought it was, or maybe it was just one of those ones where people just assumed it was a joke, but it didn't, I don't know.
John never wrote a correction in the next week's New Statesman, did he?
I think they published a letter explaining it. I think the editor, Peter Wilby, I think published a letter explaining it. But it was John wrote a nice email, and to be honest, he wrote me a nice thing, and he got it. But the problem, he still had the argument about the BBC, and that's a different issue. But yeah, and
right.
And at that time, he was to some, he's probably right. There was there was a lot of cheerleading for the war at that point. That's obviously one of those historical regrets, shall we say?
I wonder how much they
from our film, I have to say. Sorry, go on.
Remember, the New York Times actually ran a front page. Very rare for them, a front page editorial apologizing to their readers for getting that completely wrong at the cost of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives. But I don't know if the BBC ever made such an apology.
I doubt it.
Yeah.
I went with Andrew Marr, who's the political editor at the time, and he had gone on about, I think he'd done a piece to camera outside Downing Street at the end of the war, I think when George Bush declared victory, and he said this was a complete and utter triumph for Tony Blair. And I worked with him later on a film about the history of modern Britain where he actually did apologize. He ran the clip and said, I'm very sorry, I got that completely and utterly wrong, and I thoroughly regret it. Although obviously that's considerably too late, really, isn't it?
I'd say so. Before we go back to David, I want to talk to you about the coming war in China. Now, John often said that back in the day, when he was working for the Mirror, and when he was doing mainstream short documentaries for World in Action and other venues and for ITV, that there was a space for a journalist like him who was not exactly in the mainstream and who was, they would call him controversial, but in many ways he was telling truths that you didn't find in the mainstream. And yet this film, The Coming War with China, was quite bluntly critical of U.S. foreign policy that he started way back from Cambodia's year zero. So what was your role there? And what level of authority did you have over that film at ITV? And what kind of problems that was there, or were there problems at ITV over this film?
I think, I mean, the main issue, the main authority I had was as the commissioner.
Right.
And I think that normally when you commission a documentary, whether it's a feature length or a half hour or an hour or whatever, in most times you will have, particularly in my case, I like to be pretty hands-on in that respect because I spend a lot of time making them as well, which I'm conscious a lot of commissioners haven't. And normally you have a lot of input, and you come to a sort of general agreement. I think in John's case, there are a couple of things to say. First of all, he had an incredible track record. People who come to John Pilger's films or came to John Pilger's films knew in many ways what John was going to, not necessarily what he was going to tell them, but they knew that he came to them with a particular, it would be a strong, powerful, and alternative view. So that gave it, I think the great thing about John was the body of his work contributed to further work. The strength, and obviously some of that is just objectively, incredibly historic. I mean, the Year Zero Silent Death of Cambodia film, which I remember watching as a kid in 1979 on ITV on Granada. It's still an epically historical film, and I don't think there would, broadly that it was completely and utterly changed the dial and raised millions. So that kind of track record, plus his work on The Mirror, plus his books, I think means that you kind of know that John is doing a John Pilger film, and to that extent, as a commissioner, you let it happen. But obviously within that, we're still obliged under all our broadcasting regulations to sort of make sure that it's fair and balanced and all of those things. We have a thing called Ofcom here in the UK, which basically is pretty stringent. And we had a very good, he made a point, which was a very smart move, of having a very good relationship with the sort of key compliance person. And they were able, I mean, it was almost like a compliance argument that this was a John Pilger film. So you would accept that in a John Pilger film, you would get a strong perspective and a different perspective at times. And that helped a lot in terms of being able to see these films through. So in the end, I guess I was much lighter touch, should we say, with John's films than I was with the other films I commissioned. ITV has never, ever come to me and said, we really shouldn't be doing this film. And I think that's partly the history of ITV. That obviously people like David have contributed to over the years. I think it's also weirdly because we're independent commercial channel, and therefore, for some reason, the government doesn't get involved in the same way. They back off in the way that they don't with the BBC, because ultimately it's probably accepted that we have the right to put this sort of material out, and I think it's important, and it's something that I've tried to sort of keep on with and stay true to have. Well, we have as a channel, so we put out, for example, Ithaca, the Julian Assange film made with his wife and his father. We made a point of acquiring that from ABC and paying a co-production for it, putting that out in full length on our channel not so long ago, because I think it's an important viewpoint. And I have to say, in the fullness of time, I wasn't always agreeing with John about Julian Assange. I think he was right about the way Julian Assange was treated. And I think it was important that we put that sort of film out. We've also done a film just this year with a correspondent inside Russian-occupied Ukraine, talking to Russian soldiers and Ukrainian civilians in the Donbass, which I think is something no one else has done on public service sector TV. And we do that not because, and John was always very right about this. He wouldn't say, he'd say, look, I'm not saying the invasion of Ukraine was right. It was clearly wrong, and all war is wrong, and Russia won't profit from doing any of this. And while I would support Ukraine probably more than John may instinctively have done, I think that people like John have set the bar for us hearing from the other side. I think it's really important that we hear that and we hear those perspectives. The other side is as we're led to sort of see it. And And I passionately believe that that's an important part of our journalism and broadcast journalism. And also what makes, what's supposed to be part of us as a democracy.
Quite interesting. He was kind of an anti-establishment, established figure who was allowed still towards the end to have that. But you had superiors at ITV during Coming War on China. Was there any part of the film that he had to change or that he had any fights about?
So some of that would probably be with Chris Wisson, the lawyer, but no. I mean, I think it would have been broadly about just making sure. The thing is that John was smart and he knew how it all works. So as I said, John made a point of always, and he was very successful in this. And it must have been, and David can say more about this in the way that he would have put the bids in, but he was very good, or his producers were very good at getting interviews with people that whose policies he was inherently criticizing. It's a tribute to him in a way that people would do that because of the body of his work and the years that he had done. Because these days you're just much more likely just to get a rather terse statement for broadcast, aren't you? And sometimes that's okay. But what John was really good at was his technique of interviewing, frankly, often in a confrontational way, not always, but just going straight for the point that he wanted to get from them, meant that there was never any question that they could argue, oh, we had no idea, we didn't realize. I thought he was really pretty masterful at getting those interviews and making sure, therefore, that the films were effectively, in broadcast terms, impartial, if you like. He managed to reflect the other view, while at the same time giving a clear voice, and that's something that's really to be treasured, about his work.
It's very interesting you say that, because in the film Conversations with a Working Man, he was ordered to remove the phrase "working class." He was supposed to inherit working heritage, because he never did, but he doesn't say working class, and do not say the people. So he winds up saying in there that this film is about voices of people. Of course, people could include industrialists and politicians, and that was not exactly the voices that John was trying to represent. But as far as late as the Coming War on China and the NHS film, he was given total liberty, it sounds like what you're saying.
Well, obviously liberty was difficult because the NHS film was basically, just to be clear about that, unfortunately, we had to take the decision. We'd far rather not have done this, but because an election was called quite quickly, well before we had basically been planning on putting the film out. If you remember, Boris sort of went for a pre-Christmas election. Once he'd, all the battles in Parliament, if you remember, about the Brexit bill.
Right.
So it was a pretty strange time. And I think they ran for a quick general election, which I think, again, hadn't been foreseen. And the problem for us is we either had the option of putting the film out, which in many ways obviously would have been much better. We'd always intended it to go out, ahead of any election, but we'd have to have basically reflected the positions of every political party, which is part of our slightly another one of those Ofcom. It's not just Ofcom, it's electoral law in this country. If you put a film out in the actual political period, what's called the election period, once it's been called, you have to reflect the policies of this party and that party and all the others. So you end up with a complete mess of a film, basically. So we took the view to put it out, whatever the result was, straight after the election. So to that extent, we had to exercise that degree of editorial control. But other than that, and which in its way is I guess regrettable, because it's a sort of film you'd rather have go out before, but it would have just made it a complete mess of a film.
Right.
So to that extent, but then that's sort of out of our hands. Having said that, the example you gave of people banning the phrase "working class," or I can't remember the other expression that you said, the people. It's sort of, I'm afraid it underlines just the sheer uselessness of authority sort of coming in with these kind of directives, because historically it never sort of seems to work out well, does it? So I think maybe I think by the time that I was able to sort of look out over his films or commission them. I wouldn't say it was a more mature company, but I think maybe the proliferation of digital media, the proliferation of social media, all the views that are now out there in the world means that I think there's probably a little bit more, and certainly at ITV, there's a little bit more give and flexibility about or any of that kind of language, if you like.
So, David, let's go back to you. First, if you have anything to add to what Tom's been saying.
Yeah. Going back, as the films developed, his first, I remember The Quiet Mutiny, 1970, World in Action. When it was deemed that, there was always a struggle making John's films with some kind of authority, whether it was within television or governments or government departments. The wonderful man who ran ATV and then Central Documentaries, Richard Creasy, came up with the fact that each John Pilger film would be deemed a personal report. And that was embossed on the front of the films. So that seemed to get Ofcom or the organizations that preceded it off our backs. So everybody knew, as been said, if you're going to watch a John Pilger film, it's going to be a little bit different because it's straight to the point. It's straight at the jugular. There's no, deferring to the fact that you're in the government and therefore you must be speaking the truth. It was straight. It was straight, cut and thrust. We had a problem with, there's always a problem. It's not just John Pilger or anybody else. There's a problem making current affairs programs with what I call, this balance thing. When you're reporting on an imbalanced situation, to inflict balance on it often is bias. It makes the story biased. If you're trying to level it out, the best way you can do that is give people equal time. But there was always a great neurosis amongst bosses and people, lawyers and everybody, about balancing things that were out of balance. And I thought our view was, in that case, we were misreporting because the imbalance was why we were making the film. John was interested in what we called the view from the ground, which was the great Martha Gellhorn's phrase. They were great friends. And it was, the story was within people, ordinary people, the people on the ground. It was the view from the hedge, if you like. We obviously interviewed and took notice of what government said, but it was often proved to be not necessarily untruth, but disingenuous and with spin. So it was never less than interesting doing these films with John because he worked in a different way.
When did you actually begin with John? What was the first film you worked on?
The Flying the Flag film.
Flying the Flag,
84. 1984.
And how many?
94.
And how many films in all did you work with them on?
I couldn't tell you exactly, but about 8, I think.
8.
Directly on 6, and I played a bit part in other things. The last big film I did with him from start to finish was The War on Democracy, which was 2006. It was Latin America and the US.
Did you go? So you traveled with him wherever his films were, actually? Obviously.
Not necessarily. No, they picked up people on the ground. I have Spanish language and everything. I could fix things from afar a lot. Mm-hmm. But it was a budget cutting thing, really. If you could find, if I could fix it from afar, you need what we call in the business a fixer on the ground. You didn't need me over there because you could get a translator over there. Saved a lot of airfares, put it that way. But I did travel a lot in South America, not necessarily with John.
Now, one of your main roles was to arrange the interviews. Is that right?
Yeah, and find the archive and do a lot of the reading I mean, John had done always did a ferocious amount of reading, which always led to more sources. So we did a lot of that together and cross-referencing what we needed to know about things. And yeah, go on.
He got some pretty extraordinary interviews.
Well,
some of them didn't end well either. Tell us.
Yeah, there's a few walkouts.
There are going to be innocent people who get hurt, no matter a professional military, a properly behaved military, puts into avoiding damage to non-combatants and to civilian infrastructure.
Mr. Fife, that sounds fine, sitting here in Washington. But in Iraq and in Afghanistan, which is my most recent experience, that's not how it looks at all.
May I interrupt for a moment? I apologize, sir. Would you stop tape, please, for one moment? Thank you very much. Let me know when you stop tape.
Excuse me?
I'm sorry I'm doing this purpose, please, sir. Have we stopped tape?
This is very serious.
I was not under the impression, sir.
Mr. Fife's minder, an army colonel, suddenly stopped the interview as I had pursued the question of civilian deaths.
I agree.
Over at the State Department, Undersecretary John Bolton concluded his interview with his own insight into my line of questions.
One of our major objectives today is to put the government of Iraq back in the hands of Iraqi people so that they can enjoy the benefits of their country's resources and so that American soldiers can come home as soon as possible.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bolton.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
So are you a Labour Party member?
Well, Labour Party, they're the Conservatives.
So you're a Communist Party member?
You see, he wasn't known in America. The films were never shown in America, so he wasn't known. So it was quite easy for me to fix, interviews with people either who had been in State Department or were still in, CIA agents, whatever. They didn't know who John Pilger was. And they soon found out. And one or two of them walked out, but that was to their chagrin, not ours. But, he was off. I mean, the infamous John Bolton with the big moustache, of recent regimes. He didn't walk out, but as I remember him taking his mic off and saying, I didn't know I was being interviewed by a member of the Communist Party, such whimsical attitudes. But,
So the fact that he wasn't known in the U.S. helped him get the interviews. Normally, a well-known reporter gets an advantage, but in this case, it was the opposite. So people just want to get interviewed.
They think everybody in America thinks if you can say I'm from British television, you're from the BBC. And you can explain till you're blue in the face that you're not from the BBC. We're from another side of the river. You'll be introduced as, this is my friend David from the BBC. And I say I'm from British television, not the BBC. But it didn't matter. There's only one BBC, and that's the whole British broadcasting system.
Well, that may have helped you actually get the interviews.
Sure, absolutely, yeah. But we got good interviews here too. But junior ministers would be palmed off rather than secretaries of state. You never got to people. You'd have loved to got to Tony Blair, but you couldn't. He was not going to play that ball.
He never interviewed a prime minister then, did he? Or even a former one?
I don't believe so. No.
So the Quiet Mutiny was not shown in the U.S.
The Quiet Mutiny?
Yes.
I think it was shown bootlegged. It circulated, but it wasn't shown on PBS or any network state.
But of course, these days you can see them all on YouTube. You can see them. They're available, right? I mean, so I'm sure he has and he showed them in cinemas all over the world. So
on his website.
And on his website.
Yeah, but at the time, that he broke a major story about the war in Vietnam, and I was 14 or so at the time, and I remember it filtering down that they were fragging their offices, they were taking drugs, that the basically that the American soldiers, the draftees anyway, were completely out of control. And this is from John Pilger's film. And somehow and I think it led ultimately to the embedding of reporters. Because when the first Gulf War took place in 1991, we first heard about how if you wanted a report on that, a TV reporter, you had to go embedded with the troops. And this was in many ways a direct response to the freewheeling reporting from the Vietnam War that they, some of the generals blamed the media for losing the war. Obviously, they don't want to blame themselves.
That's true.
And I think that that film, he was roaming around speaking openly to American soldiers on the ground in Vietnam, was extraordinary the way that they had to react to that. It also showed that there was still some kind of understanding of free press in the U.S., which was killed because of what happened in Vietnam. So
it happened here in the Falklands War in the early 80s. Everybody was embedded on that.
Yeah, which is why they hated people being in Baghdad, both in the Gulf War and in the Iraq War.
Well, you were there in the 2003 invasion.
That's right. We weren't embedded.
How did that go?
That's partly why we got bombed. There are some benefits of being embedded. We were there in northern Iraq, where I think the American army was supposed to come in, and then the Turks closed the border over a spat. The Turks wouldn't let them use the Incirlik air base. There was a bit of a fallout just before the war. So there were other than the special forces, there was no one operating for the Americans. Even if which we didn't want to embed anyway, it suited us not embedding. But there no Americans turned up that we could embed with, thank God. So out of Erbil, and all there were the special forces who were basically operating, and they were the guys sending the coordinates up to the F-14s flying in from the Eastern Mediterranean aircraft carriers and giving them coordinates. Although it turned out that when we got bombed, they didn't bother with coordinates. They basically told them it's to your south and your north, and the pilots got north and south confused.
God.
And that, honestly, that's the truth, because we spent a lot of time afterwards. We had to go and be briefed in the Pentagon about what had happened. And I think because it was a very, very tense fight. There was basically a firefight going on, and they needed them to drop the bombs, and they got some things confused. Anyway, they bombed their own side. So they bombed the Kurdish Peshmerga. So that was excellent. But you're right. I think John, I mean, in some ways you've sort of slightly undermined my belief that John had phrased his right replies, his bids, well, you and John had written your bids so well, so cunningly, that they thought this sounds like a very good project. Obviously, it was just they had no idea who he was, and assumed he must be someone proper from the BBC. But I'm sure that by the end they would have understood. I think also there's probably in American television, there's sort of perhaps a little bit more of a culture of people doing television interviews. It's a bigger. I think it's increasingly difficult in this country to get senior politicians to take part in documentaries because they don't like losing that control over what they say. They'll do stuff live, but they won't appear in a documentary unless they think it's completely something that they can, where their own view will go unfiltered, put it that way.
David, one of the most extraordinary interviews I think John did was with that former CIA officer who was unapologetically sociopathic and not caring about the deaths the CIA causes.
Duane Claridge was head of the CIA's Latin American division in the early 1980s.
Chile, the only reason it exists is because of Pinochet.
At a huge human price.
What human price? Give me a break.
The thousands who were disappeared and murdered.
Thousands? You count them. What thousands?
Well,
and
talk
to me about truth commissions.
I've seen their names in the cemetery in Santiago.
Yeah,
you're saying
they're
thousands.
Faces. They aren't thousands.
Well,
there aren't thousands, sir.
It was a period in which almost everybody
in the present situation regards as a dark time in which the CIA played a major role.
That's right. They played a major role in overthrowing, what's his name?
What's his name was Salvador Allende.
Yeah, fine. Okay.
He was democratically elected.
Right. Okay.
Is that okay to overthrow a democratically elected government? Is it okay?
It depends on what your national security interests are.
Are you denying that Pinochet caused huge suffering in that country?
I don't buy. That he committed crimes, I agree.
Mm-hmm. But it's worth it.
Huh?
Is that what you're saying? Those crimes are worth it?
Yeah. Sometimes, unfortunately, things have to be changed in a rather ugly way.
According to the Truth Commission and a whole swathe of human...
Let me, John. This is where we're going. You're wasting my time. That's all bullshit. Those people all had agendas.
So it was bullshit that the Salvadorian military were murdering tens of thousands of people.
I bet you can't count more than 200 in the whole 10 or 12 years. You're taking the stuff from these propaganda mills. And I'm not interested.
What are the propaganda mills?
All these things, this truth thing and all that. They're nothing but propaganda mills.
Do you really think
I didn't know so.
Are they all conning us, lying us?
Yeah,
Amnesty International?
Amnesty International's right in the middle of it.
What right have you, when I mean you, the CIA, the United States government, or any foreign power, what right do you have to do what you do in other countries?
National security interests.
But that's a divine right, isn't it? Because the people that you do it to have no say in this.
Yeah, well, that's just tough.
What film was that? And tell me the backstory.
I think you're talking about the War on Democracy. That was Duane Claridge, who I'd met on a previous film. He'd wrote his memoirs and everything. He'd been head of CIA operations in South and Central America for a while, and all over the place. He was very proud of his role in the whole business of keeping communism away from America. He just didn't believe the fact that Pinochet had killed thousands of people. His very line was, well, maybe a few hundred, and so you cut to the memorial in Santiago where carved in stone are the thousands of people's names. Duane Dewey Claridge, he may still be alive. He tried to insist that the interview would never be used, but we used it and never heard from him again. But he'd been in. He had a long track record, Duane. If I just said Oliver North to you and all sorts of other names and Noriegas and people like that, he had a long track record. Last heard of in Pakistan, running some agency of I don't know what, but he'd be of an age now. He'd be about 90 or something now. He may no longer be with us. I don't know, but that's the man.
Was he involved in the Pinochet in the coup?
No.
Overthrew Allende? No, that was before his time.
No, he came into a serious action around just before the Oliver North saga. The arms and the Ayatollah.
Unconscious scandal, yeah.
But he'd been involved in Italy. He'd been all over Europe. When I first met him in London, he took me to his club. But we were on a very easy. I was working on a series called Cold War at the time. This is a big Jeremy Isaacs production here, and it was basically talking about what we did in the Cold War, which was easy because it was over and we'd won. So that wasn't controversial, but he did tell me, I think it's in the film, how they invented how he came up with the idea of mining the harbors in Corinto to stop the Nicaraguans getting fuel oil. And it was when he was lying in his bath playing with his rubber ducks, and he thought, I know what I'll do. We'll sink the mines into the harbors and tell Lloyd's of London we've done it, and no boat will ever go in there. And it's exactly what happened. I mean, you know, he's not ashamed of what he did at all, this guy.
International Court of Justice ruled that that was illegal and that they had to stop it, by the way. And of course,
too late.
Immediately.
Yeah.
But if it weren't for John Pilger's style of interviewing, I wonder if you would have gotten that kind of response from this guy, which was just a lot of people would have ripped the mic and walked off, as you said, or like Jamie Rubin apparently did, and wouldn't allow the interview to
Otto Fritz is the one that walked out. We could never use it afterwards. And he had been involved in the planning of the coup in Chile.
Who? Otto Fritz?
I think his name was Otto Fritz. Otto is a Germanic name. Can't remember now. It's a long time ago. He'd been in the State Department in some position. Yeah, but Dwayne never walked. He just didn't want the interview to be used. His nickname was Dewey. Dwayne Dewey Claridge. That was the guy.
Right. Okay, so any final thoughts then on the opening? There'll be a panel discussion Monday at the British Film Institute. They're doing a tribute and a month-long series of films of John's.
There's 8 days of screenings, I think.
8 days of screenings.
Spread over a month, yeah.
Spread over a month. And what that tells you that there's an appreciation for John's work.
Yeah, John was planning a week of screenings at the BFI before he got ill, which was it was homage to the documentary form and regretting how little of it was on television anymore, because his later films had, basically went on cinema first before they went onto television. And he organized this crowdfunding and all sorts of things were going on. But there used to be a documentary on ITV every week. It was the Tuesday slot. Network First, I remember, they had various generic titles. But he was planning this week, and it included films of other people as well, as this season will do. But since his death, we made it more of a homage to him. There are some other films in it, but not as many as he had planned. And he and I were chewing over all sorts of films we'd have loved to have shown.
How many films are there in the season?
I would guess about 15. I'm not sure. There's some are doubles. There's 2 films of an evening or 2 films of an afternoon. I'm guessing that because we had copyright problems with a couple of them. The big plan in the beginning was John was a great fan of Peter Watkins and The War Game, and he wanted to bring Peter Watkins out of his hermitage in the south of France and bring him to London and interview him on stage at the BFI and show the film again. Watkins is not well and doesn't want to do it anyway, so that sort of fell in abeyance. But that was going to be the keystone of the original week, which had to be changed. There was a lot of, we were, obviously as he got ill, the season was postponed, but the BFI, to give them their credit, were insistent that because they had all his notes and his plans, they wanted to do it in tribute to him.
Any final thoughts, Tom?
Yeah, it would be great to have him around now. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world, and he'd have a really strong view about all of it. And just last night I looked at Palestine is still the issue again. The second one, I didn't see the one in the 70s. This is the 2002 one. I don't know if you worked on that one, David.
No, I didn't. I was on another production on the other side of the world at the time. No, I didn't have anything to do with that.
And I was really struck by the again. He had a really clear. It was a very clear film, very clear about what he was saying, full of context. and yet, he heard views from both sides, but he was very good at getting the dissident Israeli side as well. And I just don't even know where that is. I don't know, where that is in civic Israeli society, but he would have been all over that. He would have been all over the subject at the moment.
I'm pretty sure it's still there if you see the demonstrations against Netanyahu.
Yeah, that's right. But I think it's harder the sort of voices he has in that film, which are really illuminating. And it really stands the test of time, that film.
Those demonstrations against Netanyahu have nothing to do with his treatment of the Palestinians.
Absolutely, that was a different issue.
I think those people may have gone underground. If you listen to somebody like Gideon Levy of the Haaretz, you can easily speak out, be a dissident.
I heard from him there was a panel up in Edinburgh, and he was contributing to that, and it really stood out just for how unusual it is to hear of those sort of voices these days.
Another really important Israeli voice against what's going on with the genocide and ethnic cleansing is the author of The Ethnic Cleansing in Palestine, Ilan Pappé. And we were very fortunate to have John and Ilan on the very webcast we're doing right now to speak about Palestine is still the issue. And then we did a full screening of the film as well. And I do think that we needed John right now as much as ever to parse what's going on. And also, he missed Julian Assange being freed, and he was such a
that was sad. That was sad. And again, but Christo at Dartmouth Films was still, was the guy I worked with, who had worked with him on the two films that we're talking about and before. So there's some of that spirit still there. It's just that obviously right now it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything John says. It doesn't. It's not the point. The point is, we need people who are brave voices, people who have a perspective and can put it out on the sort of on the public service broadcasting networks that we have. And he's one of those people who was just you could always rely on to come up with something and be on point.
You could tell the story from points of view of people that are generally ignored by the mainstream media, who in a way are dehumanized. We never hear the voices of the Palestinians, Iranians, Russians. We only hear Americans and Europeans and British officials talking about those people. So I think that was a great service that John did, is to give voice to the people and to humanize them.
I agree. Joe, I've got to go.
Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Sorry.
Thank you, Joe.
David Boardman, to Tom Giles. All 60 and more of John's films are available to be seen free of charge on johnpilger.com. And if you're in London and you can go to some of those films at the British Film Institute, you should do so. So I want to sign off now for Consortium News. This is Joe Lauria, and we will see you soon.